psychological disorder often attempt to compensate for their feelings of inadequacy by engaging one in rude and aggressive behavior. And remember how rude and aggressive he was with the teachers. And two, by fantasizing about their achievements and self-worth, which is the tall tales he told to other students. This kind of case may also suffer depression and isolate themselves to avoid situations that would humiliate them. Paul exhibits all four symptoms of this mental debility. He's rude and aggressive, he fantasizes, he's depressed, and he isolates himself. And I also have to say that it is possible that the early death of his mother left him without a source of the love he needed to sustain his ego. Okay. Now the sixth theme I'm going to call limitations and opportunities. Paul's alienation, the fifth theme, grows out of the limitations he perceives as binding him. His father is focused on the business world and disapproves of Paul's desires. Quote, his only reason for allowing Paul to usher was that, as I said Friday, that he thought a boy ought to be earning a little money. That was why he allowed him to usher. Paul has to lie to slip away to the theater, suggesting that if his father knew his real errand, he would have kept Paul home. When Paul reaches the theater, he breathes, quote, like a prisoner set free. That's a very telling quote. He breathes like a prisoner set free when he arrives at the theater. And finally, he is denied his cultural activities altogether, an event that he regards as an opportunity to escape and to live the life he wants. When he learns that his father is coming to New York to bring him back to Pittsburgh, which he considers a fate, quote, worse than jail, he decides his only escape from such boundaries now is death. Turn to page 23, please. The bottom of 22, start there, the last paragraph. Last paragraph begins, Paul had just come in to dress for dinner. He sank into a chair, weak to the knees, and clasped his head in his hands. This is when he discovers from the newspapers that his father is coming to New York to get him and has paid back the loan. And Paul says, it was to be worse than jail. Even the tepid waters of Cordelia Street were to close over him finally and forever. And remember, I pointed out to you in Friday's lecture the two different times that he talks about the waters of Cordelia Street closing over him or drowning in those same waters. The gray monotony stretched before him in hopeless, unrelieved years. Sabbath school, young people's meetings, the yellow papered room. My students from before will remember a lot about a yellow wallpapered room. The damp dish towels. It all rushed back upon him with a sickening vividness. He had the old feeling that the orchestra had suddenly stopped. A sinking sensation that the play was over. Okay, the seventh theme I'm going to point out, I call the alienation of homosexuals, and I told you in that first lecture I would come and discuss this interpretation in greater length today. Cather suggests strongly that Paul has homosexual leanings that make his life more difficult and contribute to how alienated he feels from others. Modern readers like us might find her portrait of his homosexuality shallow and uncomfortably stereotypical. Paul, after all, is petrified by rats, splashes colognes on himself, and is fastidious about odors and dirt. The only woman who interests Paul is the soprano he sees at Carnegie Hall, a middle-aged woman described as, quote, the mother of many children, and a clear substitute for Paul's own deceased mother. The prospect of heterosexual relations seems to repulse Paul. He is unsettled, for example, by the young clerk's marriage to a nearsighted, older schoolmistress. Remember when his father is talking to this young man and holding him up as a role model for Paul, and by the fact the couple has 4 children. Maybe, perhaps, Paul is more interested in boys. He tussles with the young ushers at the theater, and he latches on to Charlie Edwards, who allows Paul to help him dress for performances. Paul's homosexuality makes him feel deeply alienated from society. Although he seems to achieve a certain acceptance from a few groups and individuals, the details are so vague that we can assume the acceptance was hardly overt or fulfilling. He has no close friends, and the narrator suggests that his advances are often rebuffed. When Paul meets the rich student from Yale in New York, he makes a brief connection, and the two share a wild night on the town. But although Cather writes, their friendship begins with, quote, confiding warmth. They part, and I quote, coldly. The narrator describes this change in the space of one sentence, which suggests how quickly the tone of the relationship goes from hot to cold. Now it is possible that the change occurs because Paul made a pass at the Yale student and was turned down. It is also possible that the two boys shared an encounter that left both of them embarrassed and upset. Whatever happened, Paul is again left alone, and the stage is set for his solitary descent into despair. 7 other themes have been suggested, and I will list them for you, but I do not think we really need to analyze them anymore, and unless you want to elaborate on some of them when we meet in our small groups. So I will tell you. Number 1, artificiality. Number 2, deceit. Number 3, immaturity. Number 3, ignorance. Number 4, exaggerated importance of money. Number 5, distortion of reality. And number 6, selfishness. And we could write pages and pages more about all of those themes. So let me turn now to Willa Cather's style and technique, her writing technique. Excuse me a minute. Cather writes with great restraint. She implies, she understates, she hints, believing that it is important to leave the reader to figure things out for themselves, and that the reader should become actively involved in making a story. So the author purports to be writing a case history. Paul's case is what she titles the story. She's writing a case history, and thus she aims for an emotionally detached quality in her style. She wants to let the facts speak for themselves, and she concludes at the end, without a diagnosis, and without an explanation. In spite of Cather's desire not to appear to take sides or prejudice the reader's judgment, the nature of this writing brings one close to Paul and not to anyone else. By making the reader intimate with Paul's thoughts, perceptions, and feelings, she draws the reader's sympathy to him. The author takes the role of omniscient narrator, so that when she says, quote, "In Paul's world, the natural nearly always wore the guise of ugliness." By saying that in Paul's world, the natural nearly always wore the guise of ugliness, she is in herself justifying Paul's need for artificial beauty. And Willa Cather also has a special talent for creating the visible, an eye for detail or mood or a scene that calls on her talent and experience as a journalist, which I told you about last Friday. She characterizes Paul's thoughts of home by, quote, "damp dish towels," end of quote. And she describes for the reader the champagne in his glass at his hotel dinner as, quote, "cold, precious, bubbling stuff that creamed and foamed in his glass." That's a luxurious description of champagne. But by the use of such images and the vivid language conveying them, Cather is able to focus on what Paul sees and what Paul feels, and how intense the conflict must be within himself that causes him to want to die rather than return to the flatness and drabness that he has managed to escape for little more than a week. Now I'm going to turn to a discussion of the symbols in the story. And what are the two most significant symbols in Cather's story, Paul's case? Two of them. One, the sight of flowers, and two, a sense of smell. Sight of flowers, sense of smell. They are indicators of Paul's personality and helps us, the reader, understand him a little better. Flowers are a representation of Paul's unique personality. We find Paul in the very first part of the story wearing a somewhat flamboyant red carnation to his meeting with the faculty about his behavior. His flower is described by them as flippant and scandalous, especially since it almost seems as if Paul is proud to be in that predicament. The red carnation that Paul wears on his coat symbolizes what? His defiance. He also wears for the meeting with his teachers a scandalous red bow tie. Interesting use of color. Everything for Paul has to be red or purple. Red not only signifies defiance, but also the luxurious lifestyle of kings and emperors. At the Waldorf, where Paul is staying, a red velvet carpet is laid from the door to the street. And if you remember, the drapes in his room are purple or red. But in his hotel room, Paul also wears a red robe. Now, Paul keeps a bottle of violet scented water hidden in his room in order to help him hide away from the cooking odors of his home, which are horrid in his opinion. He seems to have what is described in the story as a morbid, I'm quoting now, morbid desire for fresh flowers and soft scents. Why do you think Cather uses the words morbid desires? Think about it. Why is that morbid? I want you to think about that and bring your answers with you to our small group discussions next week. When Paul enters the Waldorf Hotel and sees his suite, he realizes that it is not complete without fresh cut flowers, for which he sends the valet to purchase them. It is the scent of the fresh flowers and the coolness of the December air that allows Paul to fall into a deep sleep in his first night alone in New York. In the end, Paul takes another red carnation and buries it in the snow just prior to his suicide. He realizes that the flower is wilting, and rather than seeing the beauty of a flower go away slowly, he buries it in the snow to preserve the image in his mind forever. That's a very important image to hang on to. He takes the red carnation from his buttonhole before he commits suicide, and he buries it in the soul, preserving the image in his mind forever. Are you finished? Along with the flowers, the motive of smell comes automatically. Paul's sensitive nature makes him quite susceptible to the sense of smell. He clearly detests the smells that come out of his house in Cordelia Street. And he loves the smell of artificiality that comes out of the theater. Turn to page 12, if you will.
Craig?
Shh. Yeah, for a minute, I'm trying to figure out which quote I want to use. Yes, it's a paragraph at the top of the page beginning. It was at the theater and at Carnegie that Paul really lived. The rest was but a sleep and a forgetting. Shakespeare again. This was Paul's fairy tale, and it had for him all the allurement of a secret love. The moment he inhaled the gassy, painty, dusty odor behind the scenes, he breathed like a prisoner set free, and felt within him the possibility of doing or saying splendid, brilliant, poetic things. From smell, I move on to color. Cather uses color to suggest personality and mood. Yellow is associated with the repulsion Paul feels for his home. After following the soprano to her hotel, he dreads returning to his room with its yellow wallpaper. Later, surrounded by luxury at the Waldorf, he thinks with horror of that yellow wallpaper. Now, it would be difficult, I'm reading on the bottom page 12, it would be difficult to put it strongly enough how convincingly the stage entrance of that theater was for Paul the actual portal of romance. And go 4 lines down on page 13. So in the midst of that smoke-palled city, Pittsburgh, enamored of figures, meaning money, and grimy toil, Paul had his secret temple, his wishing carpet, his bit of blue and white Mediterranean shore, bathed in perpetual sunshine. So there we have the yellow and the blue that we read about, and then we will read again at the very end. Riches are associated with the color purple. Paul scorns his teachers for failing to decorate their buttonholes with purple violets as rich people might. He orders violets and jonquils for his room at the Waldorf. He is happy during dinner in the hotel, feeling that no one will question the purple. That is, that no one will question his masquerade as a rich boy. He calls himself the purple. It's very, very interesting. Find that in your story. Because he says he feels purple and therefore nobody will question that he belongs. I'm reading further on. Since ancient times, purple has symbolized the superiority of kings and emperors who frequently wore purple robes and other purple attire. The narrator presents Paul's thoughts on this subject in paragraph on page 23. If you jump there, I think I started to read this paragraph before, but I'll read it again, the second one. He had no sooner entered the dining room and caught the measure of the music than his remembrance was lightened by his old elastic power of claiming the moment, mounting with it, and finding it all sufficient. The glare and glitter about him, the mere scenic accessories, had again, and for the last time, their old potency. He would show himself that he was game. He would finish the thing splendidly. He doubted more than ever the existence of Cordelia Street, and for the first time he drank his wine recklessly. Was he not, after all, one of those fortunate beings born to the purple? Was he not still himself and in his own place? He drummed a nervous accompaniment to the Pagliacci music and looked about him, telling himself over and over that it had paid. Let me point one other thing out to you that Cather does so cleverly. If you remember in the lecture on Friday, it talked about the fact that when Paul left the conference with the teachers, he wanted to prove that he wasn't really affected at all, so he whistled the chorus to the opera Faust. And we talked about, and I reminded you of the story of Faust. And also I said this possibly is a foreshadowing. What happened to Faust is going to happen to Paul. Well, here she mentions again another opera. The music is Pagliacci. And Pagliacci is the story of this beautiful, poor, ugly clown who dies at the end of the opera. Again, I would say she's just foreshadowing for you if you pick up the references. Now, Cather uses white and blue to portray Paul himself. His teeth, lips, and face are pale, which suggests his emotional strain. White is also a positive color for him. White snow often falls during his days in New York.